Welcome to the Time for a Reset podcast, where we interview senior marketers on the big issues of the day and how they are dealing with those challenges in an ever-changing landscape. Here is part 2, carrying on from Mastering the Data and MarTech realm, a conversation with Stuart Colman, founder of Colman Media, Data and Technology, part 1. Enjoy it.
So just go back briefly to the TCF then. So hopefully things will be sort of more or less decided in the next 12 or 18 months. What areas do you think that might change for individuals, for the sector?
TCF is one of those weird things where it's not really good for anybody, but it's not really bad for everybody. Now, does it do exactly what consumers want it to do? Probably not. Does it give them the right level of information? Probably not. Is it the best vehicle for companies to gain a legal basis for processing data? Possibly not. Are there some question marks about how it works and who sits where in the process? Probably. We can sit here and pick it apart all day. What has it done? It has given us a vehicle that we have been able to go out and ask consumers for consent or ask them to agree to legitimate interest when that's relevant. And it's done so in a way where that information relating to it is there for consumers to engage with if they want. But it isn't perfect. It really isn't perfect. I do think it needs to change. And I think the two key areas for me that require change is firming up who has responsibility for what in the process. So the Belgian DPA review that they went through and IAB have been working with, one of the primary things within that was, are the IAB a processor or controller? It's a bit of a technical distinction within GDPR, but it's important as to who controls the data and what responsibilities do they have. And consumers will care about that. And I think that needs to be resolved. I don't think it's yet fully resolved as to where that sits.
Yeah, I think just to really sort of a few things you said there. I mean, firstly, it's progress over perfection. No first draft, everything is ever perfect, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And for all the negatives of the TCF, you will say it's better than nothing, right? And it is moving in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, as you say, just on that point of who's the controller, the issue for the IAB is a relatively small business in the grand scheme of things, but it's not funded like an internet company. And therefore, it can't be responsible for a multi-billion-dollar business, right? And the large fines that Google or Meta could laugh off would not work so well for the IAB.
I'd agree with that, but I would counter slightly with, but that doesn't change the law. And if the way it works requires them to be a controller rather than the processor of data, which carries the higher degree of responsibility, that's the law. And I think then the question becomes, rather than trying to say, well, let's try and bend the rules so that we don't have to apply to the same law, maybe you need to look at how is the IAB funded or how is it underwritten to manage that. The podcast is about a reset and a rethink. Maybe that's one of them, is we have to rethink about how we actually address some of those universal, uniform requirements as an industry. The second thing I'd say on TCF in terms of where I think it needs to go is on the consumer side of it. I run a TCF on my site. I use one of the paid for services, so I get the best technology to run it. And I'm a relatively well-experienced person in the industry. It's a difficult thing to set up. It's a difficult thing to understand. When you've got a global vendor list that's 400 long and the language that's used to describe and explain processes and what people are agreeing to is very, very technical, that's not a good experience for consumers. I wonder whether if we were to simplify it down a bit, if we were to make it more, I was going to say challenging, but the process of being on the global vendor list to be more robust, I think they could be good things for the overall process.
I think it's one that needs to be made much more easy for consumers to understand by actually having names on it that people recognize. So what I mean by that is that if you're on a given newspaper or a given TV channel online, because the whole world of digital TV, CTV, is massively involved in this. If you're engaging with that content, you expect that company to have some data on you in the modern world, I think. What you don't expect is 400 names of companies, most of which the average person doesn't recognize, also have access to that data. You think about something famous like the Amex BA card. The fact that that data might go to Amex and BA, two parties, is expected, but they wouldn't want other people involved in that, right? And I think that really applies to if you see an ad for a pair of shoes on a newspaper site, you don't mind those two companies having the data.
Absolutely.
And that actually sort of brings me on to the world of clean rooms.
Yep.
So are clean rooms the solution? And how can they help resolve some of these issues?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about there being a portfolio of answers to what the future looks like. I think they are part of the solution. I mean, clean rooms, they exist to allow two or more parties to understand connectivity between their data in a privacy-safe way. Essentially, if you're a brand and I'm a publisher, we can work out that we know the same person. They're a customer of yours and they're a viewer of my content. We can work out that we know the same person without actually having to share that data directly with each other, as long as the identifier that we have on that person is something that is unique to them, like an email address or a phone number or or an Apple or Android device ID or something of substance that identifies you as an individual. And they can play a really, really great role in creating an understanding of that connectivity. I, as a brand, want to be able to learn how many of my customers are on your website, and then I can make some decisions about what I do with that. Whether that's, we can understand those consumers more, and that can help influence the type of campaign that we plan and run with you. Whether it's about activation of those people, actually showing them ads or perhaps not showing them ads, that's another way. Whether it's about creating a base or a seed for a modeled audience, and I'm sure we can touch on that in a bit, or whether it's about measurement. Clean rooms can play a really, really important part in that. Where clean rooms struggle a little bit is the scale that they can then deliver, because they're working off absolute identity, and that is a subset of their entire audience of a brand or a publisher.
Let's try and also make that a bit more digestible. So I think of clean rooms a bit like plug sockets. Now, bear in mind, they work really, really well if you're using that plug socket. And also I think they work really, really well in that world we spoke about, where you have two partners, you have the publisher and you have the advertiser, and you only want those two people to know. And if you need to, you can also add in a data company as well as a third. But for me, the challenge of clean rooms has been someone that's tried to roll these out. I know you have two for your own previous company, but different markets use different clean rooms. Different publishers use different clean rooms. I mean, Meta claim not to use clean rooms, but in fact, they kind of do. Amazon are just rolling one out as well at the moment. But they all have their own different standard. As the expert, would you agree?
Yeah, I would. Yes, clean rooms are individually unique in their approach to how they do things. And that's driven a lot by the technical development around how they manage privacy and how they manage an interaction or a connectivity in a privacy-safe way. And there are some broad brushstrokes you can put on homomorphic encryption or differential privacy. You can throw out kind of different things, but fundamentally every player in the space has a different approach to it. And in these early stages, and we're still in the early stages of clean rooms, interoperability between them, standards across them, is quite difficult to achieve because they've got a commercial advantage in the way that they do it.
So should the EU ask for a single plug socket?
It's an interesting one. I think partly yes, and you could argue something like a Google pair as an approach could be a way of creating certainly a universal or a single universal adapter, not necessarily a single plug socket, but maybe an adapter that plugs into multiple. So I think, yes, there is definitely commercial benefit and functional benefit to better interoperability across these platforms. I don't think you'll ever reach a point where they all work off the same standard and do the same thing, because they lose some of their commercial benefit as a result.
And innovation.
And innovation, absolutely. I think if clean rooms are to start to scale and impact the industry in a way where they're more than just a nice idea and a promise, they do need to get better at that interoperability. And I think you'll see companies like Google and perhaps Amazon and others offer up these kind of pair-based solutions, which is a way of creating interoperability. I think you'll see more of the orchestration software, something like a Habu, play a role in perhaps bringing together more of these companies. And I think you'll start to see some of these companies just want to work together a bit more to drive the whole thing forward.
Absolutely. And I think as well, you'll have consolidation, right? Because at the moment, there's a number of these different things. Normally, over time, they merge into a few, and that will bring that interoperability piece.
I also think, and I was chatting to somebody about this earlier today, I also think you'll end up, as we see in other areas of the industry, you'll end up with a spectrum of offerings from simplistic, low-level, privacy-based clean rooms right through to highly technical, high-end clean rooms with really strong privacy elements to them. And I think two things you'll see. One is that use cases will fit into that spectrum at some point, and the decision you make as a brand or media owner will be based on your needs. So some people might need an InfoSum style high-end privacy solution. Some people might need a solution that is less about privacy and ticks the GDPR box, but not necessarily pushing the boundaries. So I think you'll see that. I also think you'll see companies start to work with multiple providers. And I think that's just a given that a brand or a media owner will end up probably working with 2, 3, or maybe 4 providers in that space. That will naturally require a shift perhaps in the economics that underpin the space. You can't pay for everybody at a premium rate. But I see a world where I, as a media owner, might work with 3 different clean room providers based on 3 different solutions or 3 different requirements.
And to sort of set the dream on this as to why, I think you obviously, but also myself, have been very keen on this world.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is because they're clean rooms, your data is safer. Whether or not it's perfectly safe is a whole different question we might come on to in a second. It does allow for the advertiser to then be able to target audiences and be able to measure. So you solve that problem. Problems we talked about, I think, have been about fragmentation. And that's led to, I think, the challenge that it's really been a solution for the giants so far, right? So if you've been a giant advertiser working with one of the big TV channels, for example, works really well. But what we've described hopefully should mean it can open up to the longer tail. So there is a danger, isn't there, with these sorts of systems that because they're relatively expensive and relatively difficult to use, you yourself to run a small publisher, I guess you don't use a clean room today, do you?
I don't know. I think 2 things to consider there. One is clean rooms generally are going to be a really good springboard for all the other things that we can do as an industry. a clean room-based solution for a brand and a publisher as a foundation for understanding connectivity, understanding profiles of audiences that you share, being able to derive insights from that then feeds into how you plan across that media, a whole bunch of different activation underpinnings, but forget activation for a minute, then be able to measure that in some form at the end. It's a really good springboard into other solutions. And we can talk about retail media, measurement within retail media that can springboard from clean rooms. We can definitely talk about insights and plannings with things like Channel 4 Brand Match IQ, which is about TV planning derived from connected audiences. There's a whole bunch of things you can do, and that's great. But to your point about the longer tail, the access point is quite difficult. It's quite a challenge. And that challenge isn't just money. Clean rooms aren't cheap right now, but that can change and business models can change. The entry point for a clean room with regards to things like privacy and InfoSec reviews is still quite high. And there's no real getting around that at the moment. If I'm going to give my data to a clean room and allow for collaboration with somebody else, I need to do a DPIA. I need to have a DPO look at that and be comfortable with the process. I need to have the right warranties, liabilities, controls in place to underpin it. I need to be confident from a technical point of view that it works. And I don't think today there is a solution in market that makes that as mainstream and as beyond the big players as is probably going to be required long term.
But probably that will emerge because what we're doing really is rebuilding the way data works, and building those pipes takes time, right?
I actually do think it would emerge. I think it's still going to be challenging, however creative and adaptable you are, to get past the fact that I can't just give you my data. I have to check the things that I'm going to do. So even small businesses are going to have a degree of, is this the right thing to do?
But actually, that's there by design, right? We don't want people to be as free with data as perhaps they once were some time ago. Those barriers are there. So if this data is, and it is, really valuable and very important, you don't want it to be that kind of free-from. But it does open up a question, doesn't it? I think one of the implications of GDPR and all these regulations has been it's favoured the giants. Now, we've just described how something like a clean room can work for TV companies and big advertisers. What it's really done is favoured the mega giants, your Googles, your Apples, your Metas, your Amazons. And that's been an unintended consequence. How do you think, because obviously I don't think the EU is particularly big fans of those giants, if you said to them that what this will do is help them dominate even more, that wasn't what they intended. Is there anything that you talk about there that might sort of help move that forwards?
It's a really difficult one because it definitely wasn't the intention of GDPR to favour Facebook and Google. The work I did at the IAB with the ABA Council was actually at the time, it predated GDPR. It was to do with the cookie directive. And I spent time in Brussels talking to MEPs that were making this law. And with the greatest respect to them all, they do a fantastic job in many ways. They have a fairly limited understanding of the internet. And I spent a lot of time just explaining how the basic internet works. So it's not unsurprising that we end up at a point where a law intended to curtail perhaps some of the power of the big four, big five, has ended up actually giving it to them. As for how we fix that, it's a really challenging one because I don't think there is a simple answer. And I think part of the answer isn't about how do we simplify the process for consumers or how do we simplify the process for longer tail. It's about how do we rethink the way that we do things. And we may need to say things like, I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but maybe clean rooms aren't for the longer tail. Maybe we just can't square that circle in terms of the requirements under GDPR for safe data connectivity and transfer in a world where those organisations don't have the resources to make that available.
That makes a lot of sense. If we say them that clean rooms are a great solution for the companies that hold a lot of data, right? Be it publishers, be it advertisers. A solution that might work for the mid to long tail might be the universal ID. And I know that that's kind of related to the world of clean rooms, but different. What do you make of that space and how's that going?
I think it's a really important space. First thing I'll say off the bat is I don't think identity or universal IDs and clean rooms are mutually exclusive. I think they can actually work really closely together. I think there's some connectivity that can be created there. Where universal IDs can be really successful is they do have a lower bar of entry for participants, whether that's brands or media owners or other participants, data companies, etc. It's got a lower bar of entry. You don't have to do quite so much to be comfortable to work with them. And they do offer a greater degree of scale. They are able to offer a broader access to a broader internet cross-publisher, cross-channel, etc. So they're a good solution for that. The trade-off is you don't have so much of the one-to-one connectivity that you get from a clean room. You don't necessarily have the same fidelity of data access that you perhaps get if you're connecting data via a universal ID than you do in a clean room. So there's going to be trade-offs. But as a solution, a technology that is PII derived or personally identifiable information derived, an email address or whatever, and then in a safe manner transposed into an ID that can exist across an ecosystem, that is as the title suggests, a universal access for all. And I think that can be really valuable for the entire ecosystem. I maintain it's still only part of the answer. It's never going to replace the third-party cookie, but it can be a good part of the answer and it can facilitate a lot of opportunity.
And can it also be good for the individual?
Yes. Let's break that down a bit. I think there's probably two elements that we should consider. One is it good for consumers that their internet experience or their digital experience can be adapted to their interests? Is that a good thing? Yes. Years ago, there was an IAB study done that said that 74% of people didn't want to be tracked online, but 84% of people wanted advertising more relevant to them. Now, they're made up numbers because I can't remember the actual numbers, but the point remains is that people want an internet that actually makes sense to them, an internet that actually provides value to them and is tailored to their needs. So would a universal ID approach on top of a clean room solution that does the same thing give consumers something they want, i.e. a personalised internet? Absolutely, that's a good thing. There's still the question around how you get the consent or legal basis for that, and is it transparent and obvious enough to consumers? I don't necessarily think that's for the ID solutions providers to solve themselves. That's for them to work with the industry to improve the TCF, to make it clearer and more obvious to consumers what is happening.
And perhaps to provide options, right? I mean, I look at the following. So the new solutions, they're all different, but they do at least have, quote unquote, more privacy by design built in than the cookie did. The cookie was basically a free-for-all that almost anyone could. Perhaps not quite as dangerous as some think it was, because all it was an idea that this browser saw these out. But anyway, these new ones are encrypted, which provides some extra safety, if for the most part, not all of them. And the dream is that users can then choose to opt in to these systems. And I think opt-in is going to be very important, hopefully enough scale. And then, as you say, the adverts that they get will be better tailored towards them. And also, as a result, publishers will earn more money and everyone's happier. Does that also then leave a world, though, for people who go, you can tell me it's safe all you like, but I just don't want it. I want to opt out. Do you think that's going to be a big part of the future?
Absolutely, and it should be. This is about consumer choice, ultimately, and GDPR is founded on this principle, but I believe it's a principle we should all adopt, which is consumers should have a choice. Absolutely. There shouldn't be any world where it's forced upon them. I think, however, we need to do a much, much better job at informing and explaining to consumers why it matters. You talk about advertising, but universal IDs and the ability to understand a consumer journey across the internet doesn't just impact on ads, it impacts on the experience you have on a website. It impacts on how products are delivered to you in terms of how you see them, how you understand them. It impacts content that you're engaged with. It's a broad spectrum of value that's created for consumers.
And ultimately, the free web, right, which relies upon it.
Literally just going to say that, should consumers have free choice? Yes, of course they should. We should not impose on anybody anything that they don't want to do, but it has to come with the understanding that the internet isn't free. It's funded by the revenue generated by sites to power the services that they offer. And that comes from an ability to, very bluntly, monetize the eyeballs that come to them. Anything you do to limit that monetization opportunity reduces the value those sites can create and therefore the services they can offer. That journey, that understanding really needs to be driven home to people. I saw recently somebody, I think it's Twitter, there's a rumor that they were going to start offering micropayments for articles, which is a really interesting idea. I have no particular leaning one way or the other as to whether it will work. But what it would do is it would drive home to consumers that the internet's not free.
Sure, and it also share that value exchange, right? I think people probably get annoyed when they think there's all this money being made off of their data, which they're not getting a part of. And if you could kind of, as you say, educate, but also then share the benefit, right? So the value exchange is so important that people understand what it is. The adage that if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. I think that is true. But if that's transparent, then that's okay, I would have thought.
Absolutely. And I know there's been, I'm sure we'll talk about some emerging technologies soon. I know there's been a few companies launched over the last few years who try to put the power back in the consumer's hands and say, hey, monetize your own data. I think there was a browser that was on Dragon's Den a while ago that did it, and I know there's been 2 or 3 other companies launched. The fundamental challenge there, I believe, with those kind of approaches, I think superficially it's a nice idea, but fundamentally consumers don't really care. We're quite lazy as consumers. We're quite passive rather than lazy, actually, in terms of expressing our interest in stuff. And the only time we would actively express an interest in stuff that could create value would be when we think there's something in it for us.
Yeah, and on that user value point, from the advertiser's point of view, everyone thinks advertisers want to target them, but actually they don't. They want to reach millions of people, right? So that lots of individuals might then go and buy their products. But actually, I think the challenge for all of these new systems, I really like the idea, but unless you have enough scale there, or enough scale within a certain audience, a certain niche, to make it worthwhile running against it, ultimately, every time we have one of these new ecosystems, if you like, you need to go and pay somebody to work out how to advertise on it. And you're not going to do that for 5 men and 3 dogs, right?
No, absolutely. But that speaks to what I said right at the start about this kind of new portfolio approach. And one of the big changes, the reset changes we need is this ability to work across different platforms and stitch stuff together. You're absolutely right. But I think there's some really exciting opportunities, whether it's data connectivity driven by clean rooms or whether it's the role of second and third party data providers working with universal ID solutions. I think there's huge opportunity for looking at new ways to create scale and create opportunity there. Things like modelled audiences, the role of AI in creating and understanding consumer journeys. Digital twins, there's a new company called Rayn, RAYN, who are launching or trying something called digital twins of consumers, which is all about creating models of consumers and then mapping through journeys to understand what could happen. There's ways in which we can use these foundations of data that we're able to create through universal IDs and clean rooms to create other opportunities like campaign modeling, like lookalike audiences, etc., to create the scale and the value that we want without necessarily the direct targeting.
Well, that's it. I think we've had an amazing run through of identity and the solutions and problems around that the last half an hour or so. Let's kind of line up a little bit by talk about the world of AI and some of the new things that are emerging. I mean, has it changed? Is it the same thing again? What's your take on the world of AI in the last few months and the hype and pushback on AI?
I think AI is incredibly exciting and incredibly scary, I think is probably the way I put it. Our interest is AI in advertising and marketing, and I think it can have a really significant impact on that space. Clearly, AI is much, much broader than that. And you look at some of the things we've spoken about today around model audiences, around campaign modeling, around the use of digital twins, around the use of smaller subsets of data to create seeds and build from there. AI can play a really interesting role there. I think there's some massive questions around ethics. There's some massive questions around ownership. There's some massive questions around privacy. I'm sat here with my computer next to me with a Cyberdyne Systems sticker stuck on it. Has anybody asked ChatGPT to build a better version of itself yet?
Before we get onto the doomsday scenario, let's have a look at some of the positives. And one thing I'd say is that I think the genie's out of the bottle, right? I don't think it's not something we can stop. If it's going to happen, it's kind of inevitable. What I would really encourage folk to do is to really kind of lean into some of the positives. And let's get your take on this. One thing that I've noticed, for a long time, IT has been changing the way that we work and the way that the world works. But for a long time, it's been locked away that only a small group of very talented developers can access, less than probably 1% of the population. The wonderful thing about the recent AI thing is it's been much, much more democratic in terms of how anybody could use it. You got any thoughts on that?
You took the words out of my mouth. It's a democratization of access to abilities, whether they be technical abilities or data science abilities or creative abilities, is significant. In the early days when ChatGPT first started coming out, I read a story about somebody that spent a weekend getting ChatGPT to write a children's story for him. Then got ChatGPT or a version of ChatGPT to create imagery around it, and they stuck it as a book on Amazon and made $20,000 in a weekend. That democratization of creativity can apply to website development and data science, etc. That's a huge opportunity. I think the way to harness that opportunity, and it's a typical hype curve thing that we see with many new technologies, is to very quickly get to a point where it isn't just about, hey, this is cool and fun and interesting and new, and this is the value it creates, and really focus in on the outcomes and the reasons for it. Why would you use AI? What's the benefit of using AI in this scenario versus not using AI? How does it create a greater opportunity and greater value for you? And that's where we'll start to see it really gain traction when you can prove those points.
And I think that example you gave about the person who used it to create a book, some people go, well, he didn't write the book. Is it his? And there's some merit to that. But that individual did tell the AI, I'm guessing, what chapters he wanted, what sort of characters. It wasn't just a case of ChatGPT, write me a book, please. He will have written many, many thousands of lines of questions to make the AI produce it. Then I presume he would have proofread it.
Absolutely, all of that. And I think it's a really interesting dynamic. My stepson's at university studying computer science. He loves ChatGPT because it makes his life easy. But we've talked a lot about, in that particular genre, the world will evolve from physically writing code that can be done very, very effectively by an AI. Two aspects. One, it's about, once it's written, who does the auditing, who does the process of checking to make sure it's right and relevant. But more importantly is the inputs, is the curation of the questioning of AI. That's, I think, where the new skills will come through. And that applies to every genre, whether it's marketing, IT, creativity. How you ask the questions generates the value that you're going to get. And that's a new discipline.
It's the amplification, isn't it? It's the fact that whatever skill sets any of us have, we can use ChatGPT to use that to a greater degree because we can automate a lot of the tasks.
Yes, absolutely. And you apply that to putting together 2 or 3 strings of what we've been saying. If I'm in an advertising world where I've got a good understanding of connectivity of data based on a clean room, and I'm able to model that or convert that through perhaps a digital twin into a much larger data set that is a good representation of my audience, and then feed that into an AI model that can then predict 1,000 different outcomes from a campaign requirement or some other requirement, that could be hugely valuable and hugely interesting in terms of what it can do to our industry. It is about the inputs. It is about the control of the data and the underpinnings of privacy. But yeah, let AI loose on campaign planning and even measurement. Can I make some good predictions about outcomes from a measurement point of view where I don't necessarily have to measure it at the end? It could be a really interesting evolution.
I think if you think about the world of also sort of ad creation, right? At the moment, if you're a graphic designer, it takes you a long time and you need to produce all these different ads for all these different programmatic worlds that there are. Meta leads different ads to Amazon and whatever. But if you're a graphic designer, you can build one or two test examples to program the system and go, right, make me more like this. And you maintain, and then obviously the designer in question still has right of reply over which ones are good enough, which ones aren't. And in that way, they can use AI to produce much, much more content than ever they could before. So they're turbocharging their own skill set while still being the architect, if you like. The user, if you like, is the conductor of the orchestra, but he has the whole orchestra to amplify what they're doing.
If I was to play that back to you, it's essentially saying the core human skills are still a requirement. You still need a graphic designer, you still need a programmer, you still need a creative person, you still need a data engineer or data scientist. Their skills would evolve into more around orchestration, curation, prompting, managing outcomes rather than the physical work of actually the creation itself. AI can step in and do that kind of heavy lifting on physical work. And that both enhances the outcomes, but it also perhaps broadens the spectrum of what people can then do. And it opens up a bunch of opportunities.
Yeah, the programmer might not write all the code anymore, but they will design the program. They will tell it what to build.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people are scared of AI because they're unsure of what that means to them. But I don't think there's anything to be scared of other than Cyberdyne Systems and Terminator and all that fun stuff. But I think it's a new discipline that people need to understand. And we need to get quickly to a point of value for that understanding to be able to really manifest and develop.
And I think those that lean in will enrich their working lives and their lives generally, right? I don't think you have to lean in, but I think those that do will get a lot of benefit from it. In terms of the negatives there, what should we be worried for?
I think there's unanswered questions around IP, who owns what, and they're to be resolved. I think there are some unanswered questions around privacy. I know there's been some big headlines in Europe with ChatGPT being banned in Italy for a short period of time, etc. I'm not necessarily sure the privacy issues are as deep as perhaps the press are reporting, but I think there are some questions to answer there. For me, I think the two biggest concerns from an AI point of view are ethics. Who controls the ethics around what can and can't be done? And is that done at a government level? Is that done at a corporate level, etc.? And how that impacts on what can and can't be achieved.
We've seen how governments aren't great at legislating for the new stuff, right?
Exactly. And that can manifest in a bunch of different ways around what can physically be done through to how you manage things that are done that are perhaps wrong, some of the deep fake stuff that's done, some of the realistic photos that are created. How do we start to see the real from the imaginary in a world where AI is so good at creating that? So I think there's some fundamental questions to answer there. The thing that would keep me awake at night, it doesn't keep me awake at night because I sleep quite well. But the thing that would keep me awake at night is bad actors. Is how do you, even in the world, if you get the ethics right and you get the foundations of it right, you get privacy right, etc., you're not going to stop bad actors. And when we sit here and say, think about how amazing AI could be in supercharging creative industries or data science or all these other disciplines that can really use AI to its strength and really supercharge their efforts, you could apply that same logic to bad actors and how AI could supercharge that as well. So I think there's still some fundamental things we have to consider and work with. I just don't know how necessarily we're going to answer half of them.
Yeah, there's no easy solutions to those challenges, right? I think some of them are around transparency and education are the best two ways I can think of solving it. Education, because if you're aware of what could go wrong, you can kind of mitigate it. One example is that I think people are relying on these systems as being correct. That's no different to the fact that people used to log on to Wikipedia and moan that it wasn't always right. If you only use one source, it can be biased. And guess what? If Wikipedia has X million articles, some proportion of them will be incorrect and some can be malicious. But if you're aware that's possible, you can kind of move forward. The same as ChatGPT or any of these generative AI programs. So I think part of it's about education. Part of it's around transparency, about knowing what's actually happened. The problem with AI is it does things that the programmers don't always expect, and you can't always get that transparency. It's the way it works is that you don't always know why it did something, which can make things more challenging. So I guess it's just down to education again.
It is, but we faced this before. I mean, I think AI is particularly kind of spiky with these things because its power is significant. And it's got access to an endless supply of information and knowledge and understanding that we've never seen before. The ability to essentially read the entire internet. It's crazy. But we have, we've been here before with new technologies. You and I are just about old enough to remember life pre-internet. The thought of having everything available on a machine in your house was just scary at the time. And people, I'm sure at the time, were doomsayers and this is going to be the end of the world as we know it, etc. But it's been, in the main, a significant improvement in the world as we see it. So I still think AI ultimately will be a good thing. I think it's really exciting right now. I think we've got a really big journey to go on in terms of understanding its impact and how we live with that impact.
I agree. I think it's a really exciting time and it's fascinating to be around when these things are changing. Which brings me on to my final question for you today, Stuart. It's been an amazing run through. But my final question, what advice would you give marketers or the sort of younger professionals that are starting out in the industry or early stages?
Yeah, and I'd probably tie it back to what we said at the start about time for a reset is, the world around us is going to change quite significantly over the next few years. It's going to be much more of a portfolio answer to things, to the way that we work, and it's going to be a bunch of technologies pinned together. Something that stood me in really good stead throughout my career, and I would definitely encourage anybody early on in their career to do, is to really understand the things that you're using. Get into the technology, get into the processes that underpin it. When I was at the FT, I worked in sales, but I used to spend time sat with the ops team to learn what they did, not because I was going to sit there and traffic campaigns, but if I had an understanding of how it worked and the impacts of things I did on it, it made me do what I did better. So I would encourage everybody to really get under the skin as far as they can of how the technology works, what it does, how it operates, what are the processes that underpin both the technology and the companies that are using the technology. It will help you, I believe, significantly then in what you then do with it and help the industry move forward.
Yeah, lead into the future, right? Lead into change.
Absolutely, yeah. And don't be scared of it, We're always all learning, and I'll be the first to hold my hands up and say, I don't know how that works, but I'm going to find out. And I think that inquisitive nature, particularly in our industry, which is quite fast moving when it comes to technological change and has lots of actors in it, so there's lots of things to learn. Having that desire to know more is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think if you do lean in, there's so many folk out there you can talk to about it, right? Yeah, I think we've been doing this game a while. Luckily for us is that most of these new things that are happening, we know folk who are somewhat experts in them, I guess, to a degree.
Absolutely. And you'll always find people will be generous with their time to ask. And I know people like the IAB and ISBA and others do a lot of educational courses around this. I know experts like you support them on that process. So there's content out there and there's people out there that can help you on this. Just be inquisitive. That's the key thing.
And with that, and I just wanted to say, Stuart, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute masterclass of content. So thank you for this. To everyone who's got this far with it, well done. Thank you for listening. I'm going to reverse my earlier joke. If you do actually have any questions, I would love to hear them. And we'll try and answer them on a future podcast. Stuart, thank you so much. And chat again soon.
Thank you, Rob. Great speaking to you.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode of Time for a Reset. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back talking to another senior marketer very soon. Make sure to leave a review and we'll catch you next time.